What happens when a family divides up a mother's treasures before she's even gone? Martha watched her children's greed grow, until the day her true will revealed a surprise no one could have seen coming. Martha Owens had always prided herself on her sharp wit and sharper sense of observation. Even in her late 70s, she missed nothing, especially the subtle ways her family had changed in recent years. Her once cozy home, with its creaky stairs and rose-printed wallpaper, had become a place filled with polite tension, sideways glances, and hurried silences when she entered a room. It started small. Martha noticed her eldest daughter, Cheryl, spending more time in the guest room, where Martha kept her jewelry boxes. Cheryl would offer to dust or help organize, but Martha saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes as she ran her fingers over velvet-lined drawers. Then there was her son-in-law, Greg, who'd suddenly begun making offhand comments about the future and family heirlooms, always with a too-wide smile that never reached his eyes. Martha's most treasured possessions were her collection of antique jewelry. Some pieces she'd inherited from her own mother and grandmother, others collected through decades of life. Tiny diamond earrings from her wedding day, an Art Deco brooch she'd worn to her husband's retirement, a string of pearls gifted to her on her 50th birthday. To her, each piece was a memory, a story, a thread tying her past to her present. But as the months passed, Martha began to feel more like a relic herself. At family dinners, conversations about her health became more frequent and less subtle. Her son, Dennis, joked loudly about who gets the sapphires when Mom finally kicks the bucket, drawing uneasy laughter from the rest of the table. Cheryl never chastised him. Instead, she would nod thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing just a bit. One weekend, Martha returned from her afternoon walk to find Cheryl and Greg in her bedroom. The closet door was open, drawers were slightly ajar, and the scent of her favorite perfume hung strangely in the air. When Martha entered, Cheryl gave a thin smile, insisting they were just looking for the spare blankets. Martha said nothing, but the next day she quietly counted every ring, every necklace, and every bracelet. That night, unable to sleep, Martha overheard Cheryl on the phone in the kitchen. Cheryl spoke in a low, hurried voice. "Mom doesn't have long. We should start thinking about what's fair. I know which pieces I want. Greg will take care of the paperwork. Don't worry, she'll never know." The next morning, Martha found her daughters and Greg whispering over coffee. When she approached, they fell silent, offering only strained smiles. After breakfast, Cheryl began asking pointed questions about the jewelry, where she kept the most expensive pieces, if she'd ever thought about writing a will, and what she'd want to happen when the time comes. Greg even suggested getting the valuables appraised, just in case. Martha saw it all for what it was, a careful division of her life before she was even gone. The realization stung, but she hid her feelings behind polite conversation and an easy smile. She listened, observed, and waited. Later that week, Dennis came by under the pretense of fixing a leaky faucet. Martha found him in her bedroom, rifling through her jewelry box. He looked up, startled, then mumbled something about needing a screwdriver from her top drawer. Martha pretended not to notice the emerald brooch clutched in his palm. Each day brought a new indignity, subtle questions about bank accounts, discussions about making things easier for Martha as she got older, and more frequent surprise visits from her children, each one spent quietly inventorying her possessions. Still, Martha refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she began to take careful notes, writing down every piece of jewelry when she last saw it, and who had shown the most interest. She wrote late into the night, the soft light of her lamp illuminating pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. One evening, Cheryl brought over a stack of legal brochures. "We should talk about your estate," she said. Martha simply nodded, her heart pounding but her face calm. She let Cheryl talk, agreeing to nothing, revealing even less. As autumn crept in, the family's visits became more frequent and more brazen. Cheryl openly discussed who should get which piece of jewelry. Greg argued with Dennis over the value of certain rings. Martha's grandchildren even joined in, asking which necklaces were worth the most. Each conversation left Martha feeling smaller, less important, her life reduced to glittering stones and cold metal. But Martha watched and waited. She listened to every careless word, every cruel assumption. She tucked her memories away, refusing to let them be tarnished by greed. If her family was so eager to divide her jewelry before she was gone, Martha decided, They deserved a surprise that would remind them who she really was. She began to plan, quietly, methodically, determined to take back control of her legacy. And as she closed her bedroom door each night, the faint jingle of her bracelets was a promise, a reminder that her story was far from over. As October deepened, Martha's house seemed to hum with a quiet energy, a tension born of hidden intentions. Her family grew ever bolder. Cheryl stopped pretending, openly inspecting Martha's jewelry boxes in front of her, lifting pieces to the light and musing aloud about their value. Dennis spent long afternoons on his phone, scrolling auction sites and muttering about liquidating assets. The grandchildren played games with her old brooches, giggling as they paraded around the living room, oblivious to their mother's sharp glances when a trinket was dropped or mishandled. Martha kept her observations to herself, smiling kindly while her stomach twisted. She'd always believed family was a refuge, a place of warmth and safety. But now, with every visit, it felt more like a market. Cheryl's new strategy was subtle flattery. "Mom, you always had such good taste," she'd say, fingering Martha's antique sapphire ring. "You know, if you left this to me, I'd wear it every day. It would remind me of you." Dennis was less sentimental, more transactional. "I could use that gold chain, Ma," he'd say, "for emergencies. It's just sitting here, anyway." One Thursday, Cheryl brought a friend, Lynette, a local estate planner. Martha made tea, listening as they discussed efficient inheritance management and avoiding family disputes. Lynette gently inquired if Martha had considered setting up a trust or listing beneficiaries for her possessions. Cheryl nodded eagerly, pressing her mother for decisions and suggesting a family meeting to get everything on paper. Martha only smiled, serving biscuits and politely changing the subject. In private, Martha began taking action. She dusted off her old safe deposit box key, tucking her most valuable pieces away at the bank on her next trip to town. The brooch from her wedding, the pearls, her grandmother's emerald ring, all placed carefully in a small velvet pouch. She left behind only costume jewelry and trinkets of little value. The next time Cheryl snooped, she frowned, puzzled by the sudden lack of treasures. The family's frustration mounted. Cheryl accused Dennis of stealing the best items. Dennis, in turn, blamed Cheryl for hiding the good stuff. Even Greg began to look wary, catching Martha's gaze with a nervous smile as he half-heartedly joined the search. The grandchildren sensed the tension and grew restless, arguments erupting over small gifts and who deserved what. Despite the drama swirling around her, Martha found herself strangely calm. Each day, she went about her routine with a renewed sense of purpose. She baked bread for the neighbors, tended her garden, and wrote letters to old friends. Every evening, she updated her notebook, recording new schemes and noting each insult or act of greed with clinical detachment. Soon, word of Martha's missing jewelry spread beyond the family. A cousin called, asking if Martha was feeling all right, hinting that perhaps her memory was failing. Cheryl began pushing for a medical evaluation, suggesting Martha might need more help around the house. Dennis started dropping by unannounced, checking on her under the guise of keeping her company. One Sunday, after a particularly tense dinner, Martha overheard a heated argument between Cheryl and Dennis. Their voices filtered down the hallway, Cheryl accusing Dennis of planning to move Martha into assisted living so he could claim the house, Dennis retorting that Cheryl was manipulating their mother for her own gain. Greg's voice joined in, trying to mediate, but only fueling the fire. Martha sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of her family's expectations pressing in. But beneath her sadness, a spark of defiance flared. They thought she was frail, confused, and powerless. But Martha had lived through wars, raised children on her own, and built a life out of nothing. She would not let herself be reduced to a collection of valuables, nor would she allow her family to destroy itself in pursuit of them. The next morning, Martha took a walk to her lawyer's office. Mr. Alden, a kindly man with a tidy mustache and a reputation for discretion, welcomed her with warmth. Over tea, Martha revealed the truth of her situation. She laid out her notebook, detailing every incident and insult, her observations of the past months, and her fears for the future. Mr. Alden listened intently, nodding as Martha explained her plan, a new will, one that would append every expectation and force her family to confront their behavior. He drafted the documents with care, promising that her wishes would be honored. Martha signed with a steady hand, her heart finally feeling lighter than it had in months. As she left the office, the autumn sun cast long golden rays across the sidewalk. Martha paused, inhaling the crisp air, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The pieces were in place, and her secret would soon become the lesson her family never expected. When Martha returned home from the lawyer's office, she was greeted by silence, broken only by the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall. She poured herself tea and sat quietly, the new will hidden in her purse, and listened to the house breathe around her. The rose wallpaper seemed brighter, the sunlight through the windows softer, as if the house itself approved of her plan. It wasn't long before her phone began to ring again. Cheryl called first, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Mom, can we all meet on Sunday? We need to clear the air about your jewelry, the house, everything." Dennis quickly followed, echoing the need for a family discussion. Greg sent a terse group message. "Let's sit down and work this out. No more secrets." Martha agreed, her voice steady and polite. "Of course, dear. I'll have coffee and cake ready." She could almost hear the wheels turning in Cheryl's mind as she promised to bring some documents and a little something for dessert. Sunday arrived, gray and blustery, with a hint of winter in the air. Martha woke early, baking her famous apple cake and setting the dining table with her best china, a spread fit for a celebration or a confrontation. The air inside the house crackled with anticipation. One by one, her family arrived. Cheryl marched in first, clutching a stack of paperwork and casting quick glances toward the jewelry cabinet. Dennis followed, his arms crossed, jaw set in silent challenge. Greg carried a tablet, prepared for accounting and digital inventories. Even the grandchildren, sensing the tension, played quietly in the corner, their usual laughter subdued. They gathered in the living room, where Martha waited with a gentle smile and a tray of steaming coffee. She poured for everyone, letting the silence stretch until Cheryl could stand it no longer. "Mom, we're worried about you," Cheryl began, her voice full of false concern. "Things are missing. You seem distracted. We just want what's best for you. Maybe it's time to talk about the future, about who should help manage things, make decisions if you're not able." Dennis nodded, eager to support. "Yeah, Ma. You're not getting any younger. It's better to be prepared." Greg added, "We can hire a professional to appraise everything, split it up fairly. That way, there are no hard feelings later." Martha listened, sipping her coffee. She nodded thoughtfully as each one spoke, watching their faces. She let them lay out their plans, their grievances, their thinly veiled ambitions. Cheryl produced her documents, lists of jewelry, projected values, sample division charts. Dennis suggested setting up accounts in his name for easier access. Greg opened spreadsheets with colored tabs. When they paused, waiting for her reaction, Martha set her cup down and smiled. "I appreciate your concern. It's true, I'm not as young as I used to be. But I assure you, my mind and memory are as sharp as ever." She folded her hands, steady as stone. "If you're worried about my wishes, perhaps we should put everything on the table. Not just the jewelry, but how we see one another, and what matters most." The room fell silent. Cheryl shifted uncomfortably. Dennis tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Greg looked at the children, as if hoping for a distraction. Martha stood and walked to the cabinet. She pulled out several small boxes and placed them before her children. "You're right, some things are missing. I've moved a few pieces for safekeeping. I wanted to see who noticed, who asked, and who simply trusted me." She looked each of them in the eye. "What I've learned is that possessions can bring out the worst in people, or the best, if we choose. I won't let my jewelry, or anything else, destroy this family." Cheryl opened one box, expecting diamonds or pearls, but found only a costume brooch. Dennis looked through another, an old pin with no value. Their faces fell as Martha continued, her voice gaining strength. "I know you've been discussing my future behind my back. Planning my estate. Deciding who gets what, as if I'm already gone." She paused, letting the words settle. "But I'm still here. And I still have choices to make." A tense silence filled the room. Even the grandchildren seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Martha looked at them, her voice softening. "Family isn't about what we take, but what we give. I want you to remember that." As the meeting ended, the grown children left with their inheritance boxes, some disappointed, some angry, some quietly ashamed. Martha watched from the window as they drove away, her heart pounding, not with fear or regret, but with the thrill of holding her secret close. The real will, the true legacy, remained locked away for the day when it would matter most. That night, Martha sat at her writing desk, pen in hand, adding the final touches to a letter she would leave with her new will. In it, she explained her decisions, her memories, and the lessons she hoped they would finally learn. The next act, she knew, would be the one no one expected. And as she placed the letter in the safe, Martha smiled, her resolve sharper than any gem her family had ever coveted. The days following the family meeting were strangely quiet. Martha's children called less often, and when they did, their voices were stilted and careful. Cheryl, smarting from the embarrassment of the costume jewelry, tried to regain control, sending Martha links to assisted living facilities and brochures for estate management services. Dennis, too, kept his distance, only dropping by to pick up tools or check on things, his eyes constantly scanning for valuables that had once been in plain sight. Word seemed to ripple through the extended family. Cousins called, offering to visit soon or bring groceries, though their conversations inevitably turned to the topic of helping Martha organize her affairs. Even the neighbors appeared more attentive, their casual waves accompanied by longer, speculative glances at the house whenever Martha worked in her front garden. But Martha was not deterred. If anything, her sense of purpose grew sharper. She spent more time at the bank, quietly securing her valuables in the safe deposit box, leaving only sentimental trinkets and less valuable pieces at home. At church, she asked discreet questions about trusted charities and spoke to the minister about setting up a small fund for families in need. She made lists, crossing off names and adding new ones, ensuring that true wishes would be carried out exactly as she intended. One afternoon, while she was out for groceries, Martha spotted Cheryl's car parked in her driveway. She watched from a distance as Cheryl and Greg circled the house, peering in windows and, at one point, attempting to open the back door. Martha waited until they left before returning, heart pounding but outwardly calm. Inside, she found nothing missing, but she rearranged her jewelry boxes and updated her inventory all the same. The next weekend, Dennis arrived with one of his sons. "Just checking the pipes, Ma," he explained, but spent most of the visit in her bedroom under the guise of looking for water damage. Martha smiled, offered lemonade, and sat on the porch, making it clear she saw everything. That Sunday at church, the minister pulled Martha aside after the service. "You've been on my mind," he said gently. "If you ever need anything, or just want to talk, my door is always open." Martha thanked him, grateful for the support. It was during these weeks that Martha started visiting her lawyer, Mr. Alden, more frequently. They reviewed her will, discussed contingencies, and finalized the details. Martha made it clear, her jewelry would go not to those who had schemed, but to the people and causes that had shown her real kindness and respect. She added a clause to her will, stipulating that any items found missing at the time of her passing would be reported to the police, with evidence carefully documented in her meticulous notebooks. On her last visit to the bank, Martha placed a sealed letter with her will. In it, she detailed her observations of her children's behavior, her disappointment, and her hopes for their future. She wrote with the same steady hand she'd used to craft her life, firm, honest, and unflinching. Meanwhile, Cheryl and Dennis plotted in the background. Cheryl began to pressure Martha to see a doctor, suggesting she was forgetful and easily confused. Dennis quietly asked neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange about his mother. The rumors trickled through the small town, coloring the way people looked at Martha. Some pitied her, others admired her stubbornness. But Martha remained unbroken. She attended her garden club, hosted tea with friends, and walked every morning, head held high. She even began hosting a weekly game night for the grandchildren, filling the house with laughter and warmth. With every action, Martha made it clear, she was not a victim, nor a fool to be pitied or manipulated. Her life, and her legacy, would not be divided before its time. And as the first frost dusted her rose bushes and the days grew shorter, Martha felt a sense of calm settle over her. The game was still afoot, but she held all the important cards. Whatever came next, her family, and the world, would learn just how well she'd played. As winter crept closer, Martha noticed the changes in her children growing more desperate. Cheryl's calls became daily, no longer veiled in pleasantries. "Mother, the house is too much for you alone," she insisted, "and Dennis and I can help manage things before it gets overwhelming." Her tone had an edge, the false sweetness wearing thin. Dennis, no longer content to wait for his turn, ramped up his visits. He brought boxes, offering to help you start packing what you won't need. When Martha gently refused, he grumbled about ungrateful old women who don't know what's good for them, forgetting she could still hear perfectly well. The grandchildren picked up on the tension, becoming quieter, unsure which adult to trust. At night, Martha found herself lying awake, haunted not by fear but by an ache, disappointment in her children, nostalgia for the warmth her home once held, and a steely determination not to let them win. She reread her new will, checked her safe deposit receipts, and reviewed the evidence she'd collected, dates, overheard conversations, even a photo of Cheryl's friend Lynette slipping a ring into her purse by accident during a family dinner. Every detail, every slight, had a place in her notebook. Things escalated in subtle but unmistakable ways. Dennis asked the family doctor, an old fishing buddy, for a quiet evaluation of Martha's mental state. Cheryl brought in a social worker under the pretense of checking the house for fall hazards. Greg suggested it was time to consider the nursing home, citing stories of friends' parents who just couldn't cope alone. The unspoken threat of being forced out of her own home loomed heavier each day. One blustery December afternoon, Martha received a letter in the mail, an official notice that her children had initiated proceedings to have her declared incompetent, citing concerns about her memory, her misplaced valuables, and erratic behavior. The paperwork was cold, clinical, and unmistakably signed by both Cheryl and Dennis. Martha's hands shook as she read, but her resolve only hardened. That evening, she invited Ruth, her oldest friend, over for tea. She told Ruth everything, the schemes, the hidden jewelry, the visits to the lawyer. Ruth listened quietly, squeezing Martha's hand and promising her full support. "You're not alone, love," she whispered, her eyes fierce. "I'll testify to your clarity any day." Determined to hold her ground, Martha called her lawyer, Mr. Alden, and together they gathered her documentation. Martha scheduled a comprehensive medical evaluation with her own doctor, a respected physician in town who'd known her for decades. The results came back clear. Martha was in good health, both physically and mentally. The doctor wrote a letter stating as much, warning that any attempts to contest Martha's independence were without merit. In the meantime, Martha's actions grew even more deliberate. She donated several pieces of jewelry to local charities in memory of her late husband, making sure each donation was publicized in the town paper. She gifted smaller items to friends and neighbors, those who had stood by her when her own family faltered. At the Garden Club's winter luncheon, she presented a sapphire pin to the club president, with the simple words, "For loyalty and friendship." Word of Martha's generosity spread. The social worker who had once come to inspect her home now came by to chat, always leaving with a smile and a plate of cookies. Even the bank manager praised her careful planning, noting how rare it was to see someone so prepared and independent at your age, Mrs. Owens. Dennis and Cheryl seethed in the shadows. Their plan had backfired, their narrative of incompetence unraveling under the scrutiny of a community that admired Martha's strength. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered, as tradition dictated. The tension was palpable, but Martha kept her composure. She watched as Cheryl and Dennis exchanged whispered arguments in the kitchen, their eyes darting toward the cabinet where the jewelry used to be. The grandchildren opened gifts, the youngest receiving a locket engraved with the family motto, "Strength through love." As the evening wore on, Martha made a quiet toast. "To family, may we always remember what matters most is not what we inherit, but what we share." She met each gaze in turn, her words ringing in the silent room. That night, after the family had left, Martha stood at her window, looking out over her snowy garden. The battle wasn't over, but she was still standing. And, with her true will safely secured and her legacy already shifting in the community's eyes, Martha knew the most important surprises were yet to come. As the holidays faded and January crept in with gray skies and quiet mornings, Martha felt a shift in the wind around her life. Where once her children's voices dominated her home, now her neighbors and friends filled the void with warmth and laughter. Ruth came by almost daily, bringing crossword puzzles and stories from town. Mrs. Barnes from next door began to join them for tea, eager to share local gossip and reminisce about the old days. Word of Martha's donations and generosity spread quickly. At church, the minister praised her for giving back to the community, recounting the story of the sapphire pin gifted to the garden club president. The food pantry displayed one of Martha's brooches in a glass case as a token of her kindness. Each act of giving sparked new respect for Martha and made her house a beacon of hospitality and grace. Meanwhile, Dennis and Cheryl found themselves increasingly isolated. Their accusations and plotting had not only failed, but had made them objects of suspicion. People whispered about their eagerness to declare their own mother incompetent, about their greedy quarrels and scheming. Even Greg grew uncomfortable, and soon, his visits to Martha became fewer and less enthusiastic. Martha, sensing the tide turning in her favor, invited the social worker back, not for an inspection, but for lunch. Over sandwiches and homemade soup, they spoke frankly about independence, aging, and the importance of community support. The social worker wrote a glowing report, praising Martha's mental clarity, organizational skills, and the remarkable sense of security and friendship she's built around herself. The report went straight into Martha's files, another shield against her children's legal maneuvers. With Ruth's help, Martha began planning a legacy luncheon at the church hall, inviting not just her friends but people from all over town, anyone who'd shown her kindness or needed a bit of cheer. The invitation specified, "No gifts, just your presence. Let's celebrate what truly matters." The community buzzed with anticipation. The luncheon was a resounding success. People shared stories of Martha's generosity, from meals cooked during illness to advice given in hard times. Several guests brought photos, letters, and small tokens of thanks. At the end of the meal, Martha made a quiet announcement. "I want you all to know, each of you is a part of my legacy. My greatest treasures have already found their rightful places." The applause that followed was genuine and heartfelt, moving Martha to tears. Even the local newspaper sent a reporter, who later published an article titled, "A Life Well Lived, Martha Owens Reminds Us All What Endurance and Generosity Can Build." The impact of Martha's actions was felt far beyond her own four walls. Neighbors began checking on one another more frequently. The garden club organized drives for the food pantry, inspired by Martha's example. Strangers sent her cards, thanking her for standing up for herself and setting a new standard for dignity in old age. Dennis and Cheryl, meanwhile, watched all of this unfold with a mix of frustration and regret. Their attempts to paint Martha as confused and incapable had backfired spectacularly. The community's support for Martha became a fortress, protecting her from further schemes. That winter, as snow blanketed the town and cold winds rattled the windows, Martha sat at her writing desk, surrounded by thank-you notes and mementos of friendship. Her notebook was full, not of grievances, but of gratitude. She knew that, when the time came for her true will to be revealed, there would be no question as to who had earned her trust and love. For now, she simply enjoyed the peace she had created, secure in the knowledge that her story and her legacy were entirely her own. Winter loosened its grip, and Martha's house, always the symbol of her independence, grew even livelier. Neighbors came by with seed catalogs for the spring, and Ruth organized tea parties that filled the parlor with laughter. Martha made plans for a new rose garden, determined to celebrate another growing season, no matter what her children said. But beneath the cheerful surface, the old tension simmered. Cheryl, increasingly desperate, pressed for another family meeting. She claimed it was just to sort out the housework and paperwork, but her tone betrayed her impatience. Dennis called, half apologetic, trying to regain favor. "Maybe I overreacted, Ma. Let's just talk, okay?" Martha, unwavering, agreed to see them. She sensed what was coming and prepared her records, doctor's letters, and the glowing report from the social worker. She invited Ruth to be present as a witness, then set out coffee and store-bought pastries. Nothing too welcoming, nothing that could be mistaken for a truce. Cheryl and Dennis arrived together, faces tight. Greg trailed behind, hands stuffed in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. They wasted little time on small talk. "Mother, we want to help," Cheryl began, flipping through a manila folder of documents. "You're not getting any younger. The house is a lot. It's time to talk about arrangements." Dennis cleared his throat. "We don't want things to get out of hand. The valuables, the house, someone has to be responsible." Martha listened patiently, offering no reaction as Cheryl outlined her plan to move Martha into assisted living, just for a trial period. Dennis chimed in about avoiding legal trouble and making sure everything's fair. Finally, Ruth intervened. I'm here as Martha's friend and witness. If you have legal concerns, you can speak to her lawyer. But don't pretend this is about care. You're worried about her things. Cheryl bristled, but before she could respond, Martha opened her folder and handed them copies of the doctor's evaluation and the social worker's report. You see, I've had professionals confirm my independence. I am of sound mind, and I intend to stay right here, in my own home, for as long as I please. Cheryl's face reddened. But what about your jewelry, Mother? It keeps going missing, and you. My valuables are where I want them to be. And if you're concerned about what you'll inherit, perhaps it's time you focused on what you can give, not what you can get. Martha's voice was quiet but unyielding. Greg looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. Dennis mumbled, "We were just trying to help," but even he didn't believe it. Martha stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Thank you for coming. I wish you well. But my life, my legacy, is not up for negotiation." As they left, Ruth squeezed Martha's hand. "You did beautifully, Aggie. You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for." Later that night, alone in her tidy kitchen, Martha allowed herself a moment of sadness for what might have been. Family united, love at the center, trust unbroken. But she did not regret her choices. She had done what was necessary to protect her peace. Martha gazed out at the snowy street, the porch light casting long shadows on the walk. She knew her children were not finished trying. But neither was she. Because her true surprise, her carefully written will, her honest letter, her legacy of kindness, was yet to come. And when the time arrived, she was certain her story would outshine every jewel her family had tried to claim. Spring sunlight poured through Martha's window, warming her favorite armchair and the row of potted roses she'd coaxed back to life. Life in the Owens household moved at her pace now, steady, deliberate, and free from the shadows of suspicion. Ruth still visited often, and neighbors dropped off seedlings and slices of lemon cake, eager to linger in Martha's kitchen, where laughter and good sense always found a home. As the season shifted, Martha's health, always robust, began to waver. She was tired more often, her steps slower. She knew she was nearing the end of her story, and she accepted it with grace. What mattered most, she realized, was not the time left, but what she did with it. She wrote letters, some to friends, others to her grandchildren, filled with memories and advice. She met with her lawyer, Mr. Alden, one last time, reviewing her will, ensuring every detail was in place. The envelope containing her final letter and inventory sat ready in the safe deposit box, the instructions clear, only to be opened when she was gone. Martha passed quietly one gentle April morning, the air fragrant with the promise of new blooms and the soft murmur of doves in the garden. Ruth was with her, holding her hand, whispering stories and prayers. The news spread through town swiftly. The church overflowed for her memorial. Neighbors, friends, those she'd helped and inspired. Even Dennis, Cheryl, and Greg stood silent, uncertain, watching as the community mourned a woman who had never let herself be defined by what she owned. A week later, the family gathered for the reading of the will. Mr. Alden welcomed them gravely, Ruth at his side for support. Cheryl and Dennis exchanged tense glances, expecting their long-awaited windfall. Mr. Alden began, "Martha Owens's final wishes are clear, and every decision was made in sound mind. She leaves specific items and letters to her friends, neighbors, and community organizations. Her jewelry collection, so coveted, is already dispersed, a gift to those who showed kindness and loyalty, not greed." He paused, opening Martha's letter. "To my children, I leave the lesson I wish you had learned sooner. Family is not about dividing treasures, but about earning trust. I hope you find meaning in what you have given, not only in what you hope to receive." Cheryl's face paled. Dennis shifted uncomfortably. Ruth accepted her small velvet box. Inside, Martha's wedding brooch and a simple note, "Thank you for standing by me. You are my family, always." The grandchildren each received a locket or a note, stories of their childhood, reminders of the love Martha held for them. The house itself, left to a local charity to become a community home, stood as a monument to Martha's independence and generosity. Afterward, neighbors stopped by with flowers, sharing stories of Martha's warmth. The garden club planted roses in her memory. Children played in the yard, laughter echoing against the stones, the way it once had when Martha was young. Cheryl and Dennis were left with memories and regret, but also, if they chose to see it, a path to something better, a chance to rebuild, to earn back what they'd squandered. Ruth lingered by the old rosebush, smiling through tears. Martha's spirit lived on, not in jewels or property, but in the legacy of resilience and grace she'd left behind. And so, as spring turned to summer, Martha's story became a lesson for the whole town. That true wealth isn't found in what you leave behind, but in how you live and who you love along the way.